Boyd Coddington's hands never stopped moving. Even in sleep, his wife said, his fingers would twitch and trace invisible curves in the air above the bedsheets. And that one small detail tells you everything about the kind of man he was. Not a businessman who happened to build custom automobiles. Not a television personality who knew his way around an engine. Boyd was someone whose identity had fused so completely with metal and speed and obsessive pursuit that the two things, the man and the work, were genuinely indistinguishable from each other. And when he died in February 2008, every last ounce of that restless energy simply stopped. The machines went cold, the shop went dark. A garage full of unfinished dreams sat sealed behind locked doors for years, collecting dust and holding secrets that nobody on the outside suspected were there. What was eventually uncovered inside that building didn't just surprise the people who found it. It unsettled them in the particular way that only intimate and unexpected truth can, because the wreckage inside wasn't simply the collapse of a failing business. It was evidence of a man quietly unraveling, slowly and privately, while the world watched his polished, televised surface and saw nothing but brilliance. Born in 1944 in Rupert, Idaho, a flat and modest place where large ambitions tend to leave as quickly as they arrive, Boyd was not supposed to become a legend of American car culture. The family line pointed clearly toward machinist work, toward grease and practical hands, and a life measured in tolerances and components. But from the earliest age, something qualitatively different defined the way he looked at machines. He didn't see tools when he looked at them. He saw possibilities, arguments waiting to be made in metal about what beauty could mean when placed on wheels and sent down a road. That gap between what something was and what it could become was a gap he was constitutionally incapable of leaving alone, and that inability drove everything that came afterward. After relocating to Southern California, he took a day job as a machinist at Disneyland while spending his nights and weekends in a home garage, quietly building something that would eventually shift the direction of an entire industry. He was disciplined and obsessive at the same time, and that combination, when it functions, produces results that pure talent alone cannot reach. The automobiles he produced in those years weren't loud or crude. Precision defined them. Each one borrowed from classic design traditions without being enslaved to them, expressing a sensibility that the custom car world hadn't encountered with that level of consistency before. In 1977, he opened Boyd's Wheels, which grew into Hot Rods by Boyd, and the automotive world took notice quickly and seriously. While other builders chased horsepower and heavy chrome, Boyd pursued proportion, surface quality, and the relationship between line and light on a finished body panel. He pioneered the use of billet aluminum wheels at a moment when nobody else in the industry was thinking that way, and those wheels became more than a signature product. They became a cultural marker of an entirely new standard in high-end custom automobile work. His vehicles began winning the America's Most Beautiful Roadster award with a frequency that felt almost punishing to the competition. Celebrities commissioned builds, museums acquired completed pieces, collectors paid figures that would have seemed delusional a decade earlier, and by the late 1980s, Boyd Coddington wasn't simply a car builder. He was the measuring stick against which everyone in the custom automobile world quietly evaluated their own ambitions. The Discovery Channel arrived in 2004 and transformed him into something still larger and more complicated, a television personality with a national audience and a brand that extended well beyond automotive circles into mainstream American pop culture. American Hot Rod brought his world into living rooms across the country, and millions of viewers tuned in weekly to watch him drive his crew through builds of staggering complexity under deadlines that seemed engineered to guarantee failure. He wielded his perfectionism like a blunt instrument, demanding results that most experienced builders would have considered physically unreachable in the time he allowed. Boyd filled a room and filled a screen with equal and effortless authority, and the cameras loved the tension that moved through his shop like a current. What those cameras couldn't capture was what that sustained and relentless pressure was doing to the people living inside the shop week after week, season after season. And more to the point, what it was doing to Boyd himself behind the performance of control that the television format required him to maintain at all times. The environment he created wasn't simply intense. Volatile is the more accurate word, and volatile environments don't stay contained indefinitely. Turnover among his crew ran continuously and sometimes ruinously. Talented builders would arrive, absorb the atmosphere for a season or two, and then walk away. The perfectionism that produced extraordinary results on the shop floor also produced a workplace where mistakes weren't corrected and learned from. They were treated as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. None of those departures mattered more than the exit of Chip Foose, his primary automobile designer and the man whose clean and modern reinterpretations of classic automotive forms gave Boyd's projects much of their visual identity during the early 2000s. Their collaboration had been genuinely productive. Working together, they were producing custom car work that neither would likely have achieved independently. But as Foose's individual reputation grew, as his name began appearing on its own in conversations that had previously only included Boyd's, something in the dynamic between them shifted, then cracked, then broke. Former employees later described a deliberate change in how Boyd related to Foose's contributions during that period. Designs began getting rejected not because they were technically flawed, but because approving them would have meant acknowledging a shared creative authorship that Boyd found genuinely unacceptable. He had built everything from nothing with his own hands, and the idea that another designer's vision might now be contributing equally to what bore his name was something he couldn't accommodate. The split, when it finally came, was outwardly clean, but inwardly unresolved. Foose left, established Foose Design, and became the central figure in Overhaulin', a program that stood in almost complete emotional contrast to American Hot Rod. Warm where Boyd's show was cold, collaborative where his was rigidly hierarchical, driven by generosity where his was driven by demand, and this is where it gets worse. While Boyd's operation grew more pressured and fragile in the years following that departure, Foose's career expanded steadily, and that contrast, playing out across competing television platforms in front of overlapping audiences, affected Boyd more deeply than he ever acknowledged on camera. A spiral notebook recovered years later from a locked drawer in his back office, titled Next Phase in blocky capital letters across its cover, laid out Boyd's plans to reclaim the top position in custom automobile design, with a new series of builds whose intended purpose, barely disguised in the language he chose, was to surpass and overshadow the career of his former designer. The automobiles were never built. The notebook stayed in the drawer. The drawer stayed locked until the building was finally opened. Inside a file cabinet in that same office were letters that had never been sent. One was addressed to someone identified only by initials, and its language was pointed and personal, suggesting Boyd had been preparing to confront someone he believed had taken something from him. Credit, ideas, or both. A design sketch found in the same cabinet, dated to the weeks just before Foose's departure, carried a label in Boyd's own handwriting that read, "For my eyes only," and the form it depicted bore a notable resemblance to a vehicle Foose would introduce under his own name not long after leaving the shop. What can be stated plainly is that Boyd kept the sketch, labeled it exactly the way he did, and the matter clearly never left him. The financial records that surfaced alongside those personal documents were, in some ways, more disturbing than the private correspondence. To the millions of viewers watching American Hot Rod each week, Boyd's operation appeared to be a thriving and prestigious enterprise. The reality preserved in those filing cabinets was starkly and painfully different. Unpaid invoices stretched back nearly a decade, with supplier names still recognizable in the custom car world appearing on past due notices that had apparently never generated a response. Legal warnings from vendors sat in labeled folders alongside cease and desist letters related to trademark disputes and contract violations. A draft lawsuit from a former business partner alleging fraud, never taken to court but preserved in damning detail, waited inside an envelope labeled "Do Not Open Without Legal Counsel," sitting in a locked cabinet in a dark room for years without ever being addressed. A 2005 internal audit report, found tucked inside a plain envelope, was the most direct and unambiguous document in the entire collection. The company was losing money at an accelerating rate, payroll was being delayed, basic accounting controls had effectively collapsed, and the report projected total operational failure within 3 years if nothing structurally changed. That prediction landed on 2008 with a precision that reads less like coincidence than like inevitability. Bank statements found in a locked desk drawer showed accounts consistently overdrawn, with personal spending and business costs blurred together in ways that made clean separation impossible. In one particularly troubling document, Boyd had pledged an unfinished custom automobile as collateral for a loan. The same car he had already explicitly promised to a collector, meaning it wasn't legitimately his to offer as security at all. The empire that looked bulletproof from the outside had been hollowing out quietly for years. The leather-bound journal found in Boyd's personal desk provided the final and most private layer of what the garage contained. He used it not as a daily record of events, but as a place to set down his state of mind during what appeared to have been his lowest nights. Cramped and urgent handwriting across dozens of pages, produced by someone who couldn't sleep and couldn't quiet what ran through his head. Staff he no longer trusted, customers he could feel losing patience. The sheer relentlessness of a professional life built on the production of extraordinary work under conditions that were slowly destroying him. One entry, undated and addressed to no one, read plainly, "Everyone sees the cars, no one sees the pressure. I can't keep doing this much longer." Another circled a specific betrayal repeatedly without ever naming it directly, as though even in his most private writing, Boyd was protecting someone, or protecting himself from the full weight of setting it down in his own handwriting. When the garage was accessed in 2014 by a private collector who had purchased the property expecting to find automotive history, what he found instead was something closer to a sealed record of a life interrupted. 7 half-finished builds sat frozen exactly where they had rested when the shop closed for the last time. Tools lay on benches where they had been set down without expectation of not being picked up again. Flat files sealed since the 1980s held blueprints for vehicles that had never been constructed and never been publicly shown, including one design for a hybrid hot rod that multiple independent experts later described as decades ahead of its time. Among the unbuilt designs were priority lists written in Boyd's handwriting, lists of collectors to contact, and notes marked "Do not show anyone," all pointing toward a planned return to dominance that he never got to attempt. After Boyd's death, his son Chris attempted to carry the name forward by focusing the rebuilt brand on its wheel design heritage. The response from loyal fans was warm and genuine, but the specific force that had made Hot Rods by Boyd what it was, that combination of obsessive perfectionism and sheer physical will, couldn't be reconstructed by any amount of goodwill or careful brand management. What changed gradually was the cultural standing of the original automobiles themselves. Auction prices climbed as collectors recognized the vehicles as artifacts of a golden era in custom car history. Unfinished builds pulled from the garage were completed by former employees and sold for figures that reflected not just their craftsmanship but the story attached to them. One partially built roadster, left in the exact condition Boyd had last touched it, sold at auction for over $300,000 without a single additional hour of work applied to it. The incompleteness had become inseparable from what made it worth that much. Boyd Coddington spent his entire professional life attacking the gap between what something was and what it could become, and he did it with his hands, his imagination, and an intensity that consumed the people around him and ultimately consumed him as well. When the garage finally gave up what it had been holding, what came out wasn't a diminished version of Boyd Coddington, it was a more complete and honest one. A man who built beautiful things under relentless pressure, who struggled every day to keep everything he had constructed from coming apart in his hands, and who left behind, in metal and in ink and in the silence of a sealed room full of unfinished work, the most truthful record he ever produced of who he actually was. Not just a builder of hot rods, but a man who burned through everything he had, his money, his relationships, his health, and finally his time, in pursuit of something that kept moving just far enough ahead of him to stay out of reach.